All right. Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to this episode of Think Business Live with Nir Eyal. I'm calling all the way from Singapore. I appreciate you chiming in. I'm looking forward to chatting with you because I love talking about, as a business coach with companies, how to get rid of distractions and how to form really good habits. I mean, those to me are two such huge time suckers for companies. To keep everybody kind of in the loop, Nir is the author of two bestsellers. His first book, Hooked, a Silicon Valley must read, and emerged from a class he taught at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And you just published a follow-up book, Indistractable, which explores the psychology of distraction. And so I just want to say this too, recently named one of the best business and leadership books of the year, according to Amazon, and one of the best personal development books of the year by Audible. And you were also named one of the #1 on LinkedIn list of top 10 voices on technology. That's impressive, Nir. So let's jump into, we're sitting here right now. It is September 2nd, 2020.
Yeah, we hear the pings and dings already. Is that me or you? I'm not really sure.
But we're, we've got texts coming in, emails coming in, but we're in the middle of Corona. I don't even know if it's the middle, but we're in Corona. There's more distractions now than ever before when it comes to working remotely. My kids just started school. The one's in the kitchen, one's in the playroom. I mean, let's talk about distraction and, how to deal with distraction in today's world.
Yeah. Well, let's start with why it's so important. I would argue that becoming indistractable is the skill of the century.
Yeah.
That there is no area of your life that is not affected by your ability to sustain your attention. That's why the subtitle of the book is How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life. People, especially in business, I started 2 companies. I had 2 successful exits. I'm on my 3rd company now. And I will tell you, people constantly look for the quick tips and tricks. Teach me how to sell more. Teach me how to be more influential. Teach me how to do this or do that. Like, give me the hard skill that makes me money. Right. But they don't think about the macro skills. And the macro skill, I think, of this century is the ability to sustain your attention and do whatever it is you say you're going to do with your time and with your life. And so whether it's your physical health, your emotional and psychological well-being, whether it's your business, whether it's any area of your life, requires you to be able to follow through, especially because it's such a scarce skill these days. Everybody is so distracted with, did you see what happened on Twitter? Or did you see what happened in the news? And my boss wants this and my kids want that they have no capacity to train this skill of sustaining your attention to follow through on whatever it is that's important to you.
Yeah. And I love what you're talking about. Some of the words that I use are just, the importance of daily execution that compounds and the power of discipline and resilience. And you just mentioned the word, though, I want to talk about follow through because it's almost like I think for 90+% of the world, follow through is almost impossible. And it's amazing to me because of technology that you can use, why it's so poor, why people resist it so much or fall off a cliff. So, and I'm for the long game. I hear you, Nir, but what are some ways for people to shift their mindset to get on that, that path?
Yeah. Well, I think a good place to start is to understand what is distraction, really. I think I didn't, at least when I started this 5 years that it took me to research and write this book, I didn't really understand what distraction was to begin with.
Define it. I love that.
Yeah. So the best way to understand what distraction is to understand what distraction is not. So if you ask people, what is the opposite of distraction? Most people will tell you it's focus, but that's not exactly right. But the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. That if you look at the origin of both words come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And you'll notice that both words end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction, by definition, is any action that pulls you towards what you want to do with intent, things that pull you towards your values and help you become the kind of person you want to become. The opposite of traction is distraction. traction. Distraction is any action that pulls you away from what you plan to do, anything that is not done with intent, anything that is counter to your values and pulls you away from becoming the kind of person you want to become.
Yeah.
So this is not just wordplay. This is very, very important, because I would argue that anything can be either traction or distraction. So to answer your question, why don't we follow through? Why don't we do what we say we're going to do? It's with the best intents, because the worst form of distraction is the kind of distraction that you don't even realize is taking you off track. Let me give you a great example. My routine before I started this 5 years of research and writing to write Indistractable, my daily routine looked like this. And tell me if this sounds familiar. I'd get to work, I'd sit down on my desk, I'd have a big project to work on, the top thing on my to-do list. I got to get it done. It's a very important thing. Let me get to work on it. I'm going to get started. Nothing's in my way. Here I go. No procrastination, no distraction. Let me get started. But first, let me just check some email real quick.
Yeah.
Right? Let me do that one thing on my to-do list that is kind of easy to do. Let me just get started, because I haven't had my coffee yet. I'll just get started on that easy task and I'll tick it off my list real quick. And what I didn't realize is that those worky tasks, what I call pseudo work, right? These things that feel productive, checking email, Slack channels, doing that thing on your to-do list, what that does, it tricks you into prioritizing the urgent and the easy work as opposed to the important work. Like, it's pretty obvious if you sit at your desk and you start playing Candy Crush or checking Facebook, okay, that's clearly a distraction. You're not supposed to be doing that while you're working. Yeah. However, when you check email or call a meeting or check that thing off your to-do list, you think you're doing important work and you're not. You are distracted because it's not what you intended to do with your time. So just as anything can be a distraction, I would also argue that anything can be traction. So one of the things that blew my mind when I started this research was that, guess what, folks? It's not technology's fault. I know people are dying to say technology is addictive and it's hijacking our brains and it's all Facebook's algorithms' fault. BS.
Yeah.
Distraction has been with us since recorded history.
Yeah.
Literally, Plato talked about this. He called it akrasia. The Greek philosopher Plato talked about this tendency that we have to do things against our better interest 2,500 years before the iPhone. So this is part of the human condition. So it's not about the behavior itself. It's not that video games are bad or Facebook or any of these things are bad. It's that what happens is we don't define when we want to use them. And so therefore they use us. And so we can turn any distraction into traction by simply using forethought. And that's what I show you to do. I'm not one of these Chicken Little, tech critics that says stop using technology, or some professor in an ivory tower that says just stop using social media. A lot of us depend on this for our jobs. We can't just do a digital detox. That's unrealistic advice. And so what I tell people, what I teach people to do is I say, look, you can do anything you want to do as long as you do it on your schedule, not your bosses, not your kids, not the tech companies, but according to your values and your priorities.
Yeah, let's dive into that. I love everything that you're talking about.
Yeah.
It reminds me of one of my favorite books, Stephen Pressfield, The War of Art. I don't know if you ever read it.
Absolutely, yeah.
It's such a great book, and it defines. I read it many, many years ago, and it defines something that we resist what we need to do most, and what you're talking about is what people really need to do most. Like, become master students of their calendar. Which is and why do people resist this? I mean, change is very difficult, and I want to kind of dive into that because that's kind of like the missing piece. Because I think people can hear it and get it, but then how do they overcome that bridge of disconnect?
Right. So Pressfield calls it the resistance, and he makes it into kind of like a boogie monster that is constantly pulling you away from what you say you're going to do, achieving your full potential, living out your values. And I love it. It's fantastic. And in fact, his book inspired me to, as a behavioral scientist, what I wanted to do was to dive deeper and say, okay, I like this personification of this monster resistance that Pressfield calls it, but what's going on here? Why is it that despite knowing what to do, we don't just do it? Right. We all know what to do. We know how to eat healthy. Does anybody really need to sign up for a diet program to tell them that a salad is better for you than a chocolate cake? We know this. We don't need to buy a stupid book.
Right. Or that 10 pieces is worse for you than one piece. Right.
Yeah, exactly. Or does anybody really need to know that from a business coach that to be better at your job, you need to do the important work, especially the stuff that other people don't want to do, the hard stuff, right? That's how you get better at your job. You do the hard work. Does anybody not know? Does anybody not know that to have better relationships with our friends, with our children, we need to be fully present with them? We know this stuff, and yet we don't do it. And so the problem these days, especially where we have Google at our fingertips, where if you don't know something, just Google it, right? We don't have the excuse of saying, well, I don't know. It's all there. Our problem today is not a lack of information. Our problem today is that we lack the ability to get out of our own way and do what we know we should. Why? That's the big question. This is the same problem that Plato talked about 2,500 years ago. The reason we don't do things that we know we should is not just because of the external triggers, right? So we talked about traction, we talked about distraction. What prompts us to take those actions, right? Traction or distraction. There are two types of triggers. The first one is called an external trigger. So an external trigger, these are the pings, the dings, the rings, all of the things in our outside environment that can lead us off track. And we've all seen these things. This is what people tend to blame. And there is a role to play around how we can hack back those external triggers. And I tell you how to do that in the book. But that is not the leading source of distraction. The number one source of distraction, the leading cause, is not what is happening outside of us, but rather what is happening inside of us. Because you see, distraction begins from within. These are called internal triggers. Internal triggers are uncomfortable emotional states that we seek to escape from. Boredom, loneliness, fatigue, uncertainty. This is why we get distracted. This is why we procrastinate. It's not a character flaw. There's nothing wrong with you. You're not somehow broken or morally deficient. It's not a self-control issue. What I realized in my research over the past 5 years, people who are indistractable, they don't have a lot of willpower. They don't have a lot of self-control. I used to be clinically obese at one point in my life. I don't have a lot of self-control. What I have is a system to help me master my internal triggers. Because look, whether it's too much booze, too much news, too much football, too much Facebook, something will distract you always. It doesn't matter what life hacks you use, what books you've read, something is going to distract you unless you know how to deal with these internal triggers, because time management is pain management. Let me say that again. Time management is pain management. In order to master your time, you must learn to master your internal triggers, because procrastination and distraction is always a desire to escape an uncomfortable sensation.
Yeah, I love everything that you're talking about. It resonates with me completely. I want to dive into the systems to master your internal triggers. Last week on my podcast, I dedicated the entire week to Mental Awareness Week. I had watched a documentary, The Weight of Gold by Michael Phelps, that talked about the anxiety and what you're talking about, the internal triggers, the loneliness, the boredom that these Olympians are having. And many of them are suicidal. And they talked about how they just are dealing with things. And so I interviewed my therapist, other therapists, people in rehab. I mean, and the common theme that pulled from all of that was gratitude, right? Just gratitude to be present and get into that neutral state. And so I want to kind of connect that to the assembly line concept that Henry Ford brought, right? And just made everything kind of easy. Because when you talk about systems to master your internal triggers, those are really difficult to do. I know many people who are recovering addicts who say that when they're in an AA meeting or they're in an NA meeting, that their ego is at the car doing push-ups, ready for them to come out and just get those internal triggers, back. And so let's talk about how to create a system. I'm very system-oriented like you, Nir. So I create a system for everything that I do. Otherwise, I would go off the rails.
So you're going to love this. So this is the system. It's basically, so we talked about the 4 points here. We talked about traction. We talked about distraction. We talked about external triggers, and we talked about internal triggers. So now what we're going to do, our system is basically to take those 4 points, like the 4 points on a compass, and we're going to use 1, 2, 3, 4. That becomes our system. So step number 1 is about mastering the internal triggers. So I teach you exactly what do you do when you feel these uncomfortable internal triggers. And unfortunately, I think what happens in the self-help industry, the advice that we get is that feeling bad is bad. That somehow if you feel the slightest tinge of discomfort, if you're not happy all the time, then something's wrong with you. And that's ridiculous. Right. That in fact, if you look at great achievers, if you look at people who have changed the world, if you look at people who contribute most, they're always pissed off. They always have something that they want to prove, something that they want to achieve, something that drives them to do better. And so I very much disagree with this idea that feeling bad is bad. It's how we respond to that discomfort, that in fact, our disquietude can be the rocket fuel to make us better. But what most people do is when they feel that discomfort, they look for escape. I'm having a hard day at work. Let me pour myself a glass of wine. I'm too bored at my job right now. Let me go check Facebook. The world is too uncertain. I can't get a grip. Let me check the news so I can worry about somebody's problems 1,000 miles away as opposed to having to think about what's going on in my own life. And so we have to be aware of those internal triggers so that we can master them. And so what I do is, this isn't one of those books that, hey, here's my tip. Take a shower every morning at, in freezing cold water. Why? Because it works for me. No, this is research-backed studies. I taught at Stanford for many years. The book is full of citations to peer-reviewed studies. So there's some very simple techniques that anyone can adopt to master those internal triggers. There's over a dozen different techniques. And so what I want to teach people is to have many arrows in their quiver that they can pull out and say, okay, I'm feeling bored. I'm feeling discomfort. I'm feeling uncertainty, loneliness, fatigue, stress, anxiety. How can I deal with that internal trigger in a way that leads me towards traction rather than distraction? So that's step number one. Step number two is to make time for traction. What we want to do is to turn our values into time. So one of the mantras in the book is that you cannot call something a distraction unless you know what it is distracting you from. If you don't have on your calendar how you want to spend your time, I have no sympathy for you telling me you got distracted, because what the heck did you get distracted from? If you don't know what you got distracted from, you can't call something a distraction. Right. So what I want to do, my mission right now, is to dispel this horrible system that most people use called the to-do list. The to-do list is destroying people's productivity, and they don't even realize it. They do it day after day. Have you ever met somebody who finishes everything on their to-do list? No, that person doesn't exist, And what happens day after day, this system, this life operating system that people use crashes. If you bought a phone from Apple and it crashed every day, you would go back into the store and you say, this phone's defective. And yet people use this ridiculous to-do list system day after day. It doesn't work, and we keep using it. So we can talk about why that system is horrible and what the much better alternative is as well. The third step is to hack back the external trigger. So this is where we get into the nitty-gritty of the pings, the dings, the rings. How do we hack back meetings? What is the psychological reason why meetings are so horrible? The reason is that most meetings are called for one reason, and that is so that the person who gets paid the most money can hear themselves talk out loud. Let's be honest. That's why meetings are called in most cases, and that's why they suck so much. So what do we do about that? How do we fix it? How do we fix the fact that when we're working from home, we're trying to concentrate and our kids become the distraction? It's not the internet, it's our children. We love them to death, but they can be very distracting when we're trying to work from home. What do we do about that? So I show you systematically how to hack back every single one of these external triggers that can lead us towards distraction. Yeah. And then finally, step number 4 in the system to become indistractable is to prevent distraction with pacts. And this is where we make some kind of what's called a pre-commitment. It's an ancient technique. It's been used for thousands of years, but I've adapted it for modern life so that we can make these promises, these commitments with ourselves, with other people, and ironically enough, with the very technology that sometimes can lead us towards distraction, so that as a firewall, as a last resort, we're not tempted by distraction. So those are the 4 steps. Master the internal triggers, make time for traction, hack back the external triggers, and prevent distraction.
I love it. I love everything you're talking about. I want to dive into the to-do list because I am obsessed with my to-do list. I have been forever. When I was I'm 48, Nir, and when I was 18 years old, my dad came home and he said, I signed you up for a weekend Franklin planner class, time management. And so I became obsessed with time management and learning. And I would say that I actually do finish my to-do list on most days. I'm pretty disciplined about it, but always looking for new ways on how to structure myself. So I'd love to dive into that. And I love, I'm a big fan. I do a lot of time management coaching or keynotes on how to control and master your calendar and be a student of your calendar. It's so important. So touch on those if you would.
Yeah. So, okay, here's why to-do lists suck. So I don't want to burst anybody's bubble, but the research is pretty conclusive on this. So let me first of all, let me be very specific. It's not that keeping a list of things that you want to finish is a bad thing.
Right.
What I am trying to dispel this notion of is that our to-do list should run our life. Meaning, if you get up in the morning and you ask yourself, what do I need to do today? And the first place you go is your to-do list, you have screwed up your entire day. What you should be doing, the best to-do list is your schedule.
Yeah.
Your calendar. And this is the big mistake. Most people who use a to-do list, they run their life based on the to-do list. They wake up in the morning, what do I do? To-do list. Big mistake. Here's why. Reason number one.
By the way, I agree with you on that. It's your calendar that should run your day. Your to-do list should supplement it.
Okay, right? So we're in agreement.
We're in total agreement. Yeah, I love how you dissected that.
Exactly. And here's why running your day with a to-do list is such a bad idea. If you don't synchronize it with your schedule, which is the technique that study after study has found is very effective. It's called making an implementation intention. It's literally thousands of studies have found this is a much better technique. What you're doing is basically putting that task on your calendar, as opposed to the number one reason that to-do lists suck is that it's so easy to put stuff on a to-do list. Yeah. Right. This is why most people never finish everything on their to-dos, because it's easy. There's no constraint, right?
Right. They put it on their to-do list, right? But they don't incorporate it into their calendar and master their time that way. 100%. You and I are on the same page. Yeah.
Right. And so the reason that this is so corrosive, the second reason, so number one is that you can always add stuff. There's no constraint. The second reason is that we know that behavior change necessitates identity change and vice versa. Yeah. And what most people do when they use a to-do list, if they run their life according to a to-do list, they are reinforcing their identity. If day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, you don't finish what you said you would do, which is the vast majority of people who keep a to-do list and run their life based on it, they don't finish everything on their to-do list. So what message is that sending the psyche? It is, if this is what I used to do. I would recycle from one day to the next, some task that I hadn't finished. And so I was reinforcing this message that I am someone who doesn't live with personal integrity. Yeah. I don't do what I say I'm going to do. As opposed to a much better system is to not measure yourself by how many boxes you ticked off, but rather to measure yourself by one metric. And that metric is, did I do what I said I'm going to do for as long as I said I would without distraction?
Right.
That's it. Not to finish anything, which sounds really weird. This guy's telling you not to finish tasks. Listen, here's the thing. The people who use a time box calendar and put on that calendar, work on this task for 30 minutes without distraction, and they don't care whether they finish the task. Right. They actually finish more than the people who keep the to-do list.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that whole review. I live off of my calendar. And I'll take my to-dos and make, like, even whether it's 5, 10, or 15-minute calendar meetings with myself to do all of those to-dos. But I love what you're talking about. These books, I have not read them yet, but I'm getting them when they download them today on Audible. But I want to just chat with you about what led to writing the books. Sure. Right? I went to Stanford University, but you're talking about doing 5 years of research and the commitment and the discipline to actually write this book. So talk a little bit about that, because I feel like everyone I talk to always says, like, I wrote a book a couple of years ago. I'm writing my second book right now. But everybody always says, I always want to write a book. How do you write a book? Right. So just kind of talk a little bit about the evolution of that.
Sure. So for me, I don't know about other authors, but for me, research is me search. So I write books not because I know the answer, but because I need the answer. Why would I write a book that somebody's already provided an answer for? We don't need another book that says the same thing. So I only write a book when I have a problem that I can't figure out. So I read everybody else's book on the topic, and only if they don't solve the problem for me, then I say, you know what, I need to reevaluate this. And so for me, I have always struggled with self-control. I've always struggled with discipline. Even those words kind of make my the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because, as I mentioned, I used to be clinically obese, and I had this problem with food for decades where, I would love to tell you that I was overweight because McDonald's made delicious food. I would love to blame McDonald's. It's not true. I didn't eat food because it was delicious. I ate food because I was eating my feelings.
Yeah.
We know that everybody who's overweight, let me tell you, let's be honest with each other here, okay? We eat because we're lonely. We eat because we're bored. We eat because we feel ashamed that we overate. And it's the same thing when it comes to every distraction out there, whether it's too much Facebook or too much news or too much booze. It's about what's going on inside of us.
Yeah.
And if we just keep blaming the instruments, the proximal causes, and we don't get to the root cause, this will always be a problem. So for me, my turning point was when I was with my daughter one afternoon, and we had this beautiful time planned together. We had this book of activities that daddies and daughters could play together. And I remember that there was in this book, there was a question that daddies and daughters could ask each other to kind of, bond and get closer to each other. And the question was, if you could have any superpower, what superpower would you want? And I remember the question verbatim, but I don't remember what my daughter said, because in that moment, that was when I decided to let me just see this one thing on my phone. My phone just buzzed here. Let me just check this one thing. And when I looked up from my phone, my daughter had left the room. She got the message that whatever was on my phone was more important than she was.
Yeah.
And she went to go play with some toy outside. And if I'm really honest with you, it didn't just happen with my daughter. It would happen when I would say I was going to work out and I didn't. Yeah. Or I would say I was going to work on that big project and I wouldn't. And I kept finding that, if I could have any superpower, a realistic superpower, I would want the power to just follow through on everything that I know I wanted to do. I mean, wouldn't that be amazing? Wouldn't that be a superpower? And so I did what I always did. I read a bunch of books on the topic, and the popular literature promoted by the media these days is that it's all tech's fault, right? That just stop checking Facebook, just stop checking email, just stop looking at your phone. It's all technology's fault, but that's stupid. I mean, we'll get fired from our jobs if we do that, most of us. It's very elitist advice. Yeah. And it didn't work. And in fact, I got this $12 flip phone, like in the 90s. And I said, okay, well, it must be the internet. It must be all these apps. So I got rid of that stuff. And even when I had this flip phone, I also got myself a word processor from the 1990s that didn't have any internet connection. And even when I had these things that didn't have an internet connection, I would say, oh, you know what? There's that book on my bookcase that I've been meaning to finish. Or, oh, you know what? Let me tidy up my desk, or let me take out the trash. I would still find ways to get distracted because I hadn't addressed the root cause of why I was getting distracted in the first place. So that's what prompted me along this journey.
Yeah, I love everything you're talking about. It resonates with me completely. My last question, then I have a quick speed round, is what do people do to figure out what their root cause is? Like I've been going to I was sharing, I interviewed my therapist that I've been going to for 17 years on Tuesday, and it was great amongst other people, but it's a lot of work to get those internal triggers run deep. And so what do people need to do to not just identify, but really dive in?
Yeah. So in this respect, it's not quite as hard as you think. It starts from using these 4 tactics in concert. So one of the simplest things you could do is to simply define how you want to spend your time. And I'm not just talking about work time. I'm not talking about, making time for all those things on your to-do list. If you want to play video games, great, do it. If you want to go on social media, enjoy. If you want to watch Netflix, wonderful. But make time for those things. And then if you get distracted from something, let's say you book 30 minutes for writing that blog post or working on your novel or spending time with your kids, whatever it might be, and you find yourself tempted towards distraction, the technique I talk about in the book and I subscribe to is from acceptance and commitment therapy. And this has been around for decades. This is not something new, very well verified, very well researched. And so one of the first techniques that is used in acceptance and commitment therapy is to understand what that internal trigger is what is the source of that distraction by trying to find out what occurred right before that sensation. What was that feeling? If you can simply putting a name to, okay, I'm feeling this urge to check my cell phone. Okay, where is that coming from? Oh, it's boredom, it's stress, it's uncertainty, it's anxiety. What is that? And if you can just write it down, even just taking on a little piece of paper, with a pen, just writing down what is that sensation. That's a first huge step, just the first thing that comes to mind. Yeah. Then what we want to do is to get curious about that sensation, not contemptuous. What most people do, they form this habit of a shame spiral, where they say, oh, there I go again. I have a short attention span. I have an addictive personality. They start heaping on all this shame and all these characteristics that really don't serve them. They harm them. And of course, the more shame we feel, shame is a very uncomfortable internal trigger. And so the more we look for escape from that internal trigger with, guess what? More distraction. So what we want to do is to get curious about that sensation without judgment, without trying to shame ourselves, but instead exploring it with curiosity rather than contempt. And then one technique that I use almost every day is called the 10-minute rule. And the 10-minute rule says that for many things, strict abstinence is not a good idea. So for some things, abstinence works, right? If you're fighting a drug addiction, for example, sometimes in some cases, even then it's questionable. But having strict abstinence, saying, no, I will not do that, actually can make it more desirable. It's like pulling on a rubber band. When you tell yourself, no, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, it makes you more likely to want to give in for the pleasure of releasing the tension of telling yourself no.
Yeah.
So instead of telling ourselves no, what we want to do is to tell ourselves not yet.
Yeah.
And so this is where the 10-minute rule comes from. So if you can say to yourself, hey, you know what? I really want that cigarette. I really want that piece of chocolate cake. I really want to check Facebook for a minute. I really want to check email. Instead, you can tell yourself, okay, not right now. I will give in 10 minutes. But for those 10 minutes, here's what I want you to do. You have two choices. You can either give in to whatever it is you said you were going to do with your time, not the temptation, but the thing you said you were going to do. I said, I'm going to work on this blog post. I said, I'm going to play with my kids. I said, I'm going to do whatever it is I intended to do with my time.
Yeah.
Or I can sit with that sensation with curiosity rather than contempt. So just to sit with that sensation, what is it that I'm experiencing? And I teach you how to change that dialogue. As opposed to beating yourself up, you're saying, okay, so this happens to me every day. When I'm writing is really hard work, right? It never becomes a habit. It's always difficult. And so when I change that dialogue of, okay, this is difficult. Why is this difficult? I used to go into the shame spiral. Well, now I tell myself, okay, this is what it feels like to get better at something, right? So it's about changing that conversation and exploring that sensation with curiosity rather than contempt. And what you will find is by the time those 10 minutes are up, 9 times out of 10, that sensation, that internal trigger has crested and then subsided. So what you want to do is to surf the urge long enough for that emotion to pass over. And this is how we begin to learn to master those internal triggers. Now, that's just one of dozens of techniques that we can use.
I love what you're talking about as far as just changing your own narrative and effective communication with yourself. One of my favorite books that I'm actually reading again right now, I think for like the 7th or 8th time, is The 4 Agreements. And one of the agreements is be impeccable with your word to yourself.
Yeah. As
far as self-talk. And
it's so true.
It really can get you in trouble. So, wow, this has been, I feel like I got a Stanford master's class today.
Oh, this is just the tip of the iceberg. I can't wait to hear what you think of the book. I'd love for you to give me some feedback.
But just a couple last minute speed round questions. Your favorite book and why?
Oh, my favorite book. I don't know about my favorite book, but a book I read recently that I really enjoyed was Factfulness by Hans Rosling. That was a great book. I recommend.
All right, good. Best piece of wisdom you've ever received?
Best piece of wisdom I've ever received. I think there's a Benjamin Franklin quote. He said, if everyone is thinking alike, then no one is thinking.
Yeah, that's a good one.
So I think sometimes it's good to be a contrarian.
Yeah. Finish this sentence. The one thing people need to do in 2020 is
be indistractable, of course.
That's a great way to end. Nir, tell everybody where they can connect with you, buy your books, and all that other great stuff.
Sure. So my website is nirandfar.com, but Nir is spelled like my first name. So that's NIR&FAR.com, nirandfar.com. And if you go to nirandfar.com, there's actually a complimentary 80-page workbook that we couldn't fit into the final edition of the book, but you can get it for free at Nir and Far. It will help you become indistractable, whether or not you buy the book. So check that out. You can get that at my blog. And the book is called Indistractable: How to Control Your Attention and Choose Your Life.
It's great. Nir, I can't thank you enough, man. This was great. I really enjoyed our conversation, and I appreciate. What time is it in Singapore right now?
It is almost 9 o'clock p.m.
p.m. Okay, so it's almost 9 o'clock a.m. here. Well, I appreciate you chiming in and giving us all this great wisdom today. This was outstanding. So
my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no, man. Thanks very much, and stay safe, and have a great rest of the day and the year.
Thank you so much. You too. Take care. Thanks again.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.